More amendments. Okay, so let us remember what's important here. Economists say we always have to look at incentives, that incentives drive the world, that it's not appealing to people's morality or their inner good or whatever. Incentives. What incentives do people have to do whatever it is that they do? We are constantly creating externalities. Much of what we do creates externalities. It creates costs or benefits for other people who don't have a say. We're the government. We're affecting large numbers of people. We have small numbers of people making decisions that affect large numbers of people. There's going to be lots and lots of externalities, and we have to think about those benefits and costs. We also have to think about what we call unintended consequences, which is something happens that we didn't anticipate, we didn't think about. When the government first started individual retirement accounts, IRAs, there wasn't a limit on it. And the first year they did it, it actually negatively impacted tax revenues because so many people were saving so much money that it hurt tax revenues, and they put a significant limit on how much you could put into your IRA. And our buddy Adam Smith and our buddy Thomas Jefferson, they're very concerned about property rights. A lot of what's in the Constitution, a lot of what's in their philosophy comes from the government's primary function being to protect our rights, not to be in charge of things, but as to live as the protector of our rights. It's our rights that are the key, not wisdom or the government. Protect our rights, property rights. All right, 9 and 10. 9 and 10 go together. 9 and 10 are about James Madison there and his concern about what a Bill of Rights would do. That if we list things in the Bill of Rights, and trust me, I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be a Bill of Rights. We absolutely need the 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th to protect us. But he wanted to make clear, remember, his concerns. So here we have 9. The enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. We have unalienable rights, and this is not a list of them. Amendments 1 through 8 is not a list of our rights. We have these rights, and they didn't write them all down. We have rights, and they're retained by us whether or not they're in the Constitution. It's hard to find any time where the Supreme Court, though, has used the 9th in a court case. They don't use it very often. It's like it's not there. And I'm sure that Mr. Madison would not be happy with how ignored the 9th is. Okay, the 10th. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So again, we have Section 1, or Part 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Here's what Congress can do. 9, here's what Congress, Section 9, here's what Congress can't do. 10, here's what the states can't do. This says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That suggests that anything that's not in 8, which is not prohibited by 10, belongs to the states or us and not to the federal government. But again, McCullough versus Maryland, right? The Supreme Court has said, even if it's not in 8, as long as it's not prohibited by 9, the federal government can still do it. So this might suggest, and again, I am not a constitutional scholar, but if you read this, education's not in the Constitution. It never mentions public education. That would seem to be reserved to the states or to the people. and not a federal issue. And yet the federal government does a lot of stuff in education, and they do it because McCullough versus Maryland says they can. 10, Madison's interpretation of 10 and Jefferson's interpretation of 10 would be that the federal government can't. So we're back to this whole enumerated powers versus implied powers versus this long-standing 250 years of argument. For example, the Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government cannot tell a state what has to be in their driver's licenses and how they make their driver's licenses. And they can't tell you that you have to carry your driver's license around with you all the time. You are a citizen of the United States. You are not in Russia. You are not required to carry identification on you. But the federal government basically controls what driver's licenses look like. And they do it because they have the right to say what you need to get on an airplane. And if you want to get on an airplane and you want to use your driver's license to do it, then the state has to follow federal driver's license rules. We've already talked about this one. The federal government does not have the right to tell Nevada what its speed limit is, but it controls speed limits in the United States, and it does it by saying you're not going to get federal highway funds unless you follow the federal speed limit rules. So there's direct ways that the government does these sorts of things, but 9 and 10 prohibit the government from doing certain things, particularly 10, right? 10th Amendment prevents the federal government from setting out the rules for driver's licenses. But because they have the right to regulate interstate commerce, they can make a rule for driver's licenses to get on an airplane, and that forces all the states to follow the federal driver's license rule. All right, 11's really simple. Whoever came in second in the presidential election used to become the vice president, but that was before, when the country was founded, that was before we had political parties. Once we established a two-party political system, we changed the Constitution so that both the president and vice president will be from the same party. It's not required that it be that way in the Constitution, but there's a separate vote now. Instead of just a vote for president, and who's in second is the VP, there's separate votes for the president and the vice president. 12 is the first of what we call the Civil War amendments. 12 says slavery and indentured servitude. So not just did it outlaw slavery in the United States, there used to be an arrangement where you could sign up and go to work for somebody. So you could be living in England, someone in Virginia could pay your way to the United States, and you would agree to be their 24/7, 365 employee with no pay for the next 7 years. Those things were also outlawed by the 12th Amendment. Slavery is not legal. The Founding Fathers did a lot of compromising. Most of those compromises turned out really well. Their compromise on slavery did not. And the compromises that came out in between the founding of the United States and the Civil War didn't work too well either. The Founding Fathers, besides the fact that a lot of them were slave owners, George Washington was a slave owner, though he freed his slaves when he died. Thomas Jefferson, of course, had a really long affair with one of his slaves. He freed their children when he died. But he believed, and he wrote, that he didn't think that black people were as smart, basically, as white people, and they couldn't take care of themselves. So there's a lot of racism in what went on in the convention and the setting up here. There's a economists have argued, and some of the founding fathers argued that slavery would die out on its own because it wasn't economical. Economists have studied slavery over the years, and our conclusion is that it is in fact economical, except for, kind of the small family farm. If that's what we had, then probably slavery would have died out. But slavery, cheap, free labor that you don't have to care about, that was a lame excuse to build a theory on that it was going to die out because it's not economical. Especially with the invention of the cotton gin, the South made a lot of money off of slavery. Their whole economy was built on slavery. For the wealthy landowners, there were, lots of people. Most Southerners weren't slave owners, but the major players in the world in the South, the big landowners, all relied on slavery to make their economic system work. It's not that it wasn't economic, and the compromises that they came up with simply weren't gonna work. One of those compromises, and I'll just give you this little bit because it applies to Nevada, what we're going to talk about. They drew a line and they said, south of this line is slavery, north of this line is not slavery, the Missouri Compromise. So we have slave states and free states, and if you're south, one of the causes of the Civil War, and that was, again, years after the Constitution, but one of the causes of the Civil War is that Arizona, New Mexico, all of southern part of California would have been slave regions under that compromise as America moved west. And Northerners and, the Confederacy wanted to take over Mexico. They thought we could take over the whole country of Mexico, and that would all be slave area. And there was this huge expansion planned of slavery. You live in Las Vegas, you're below the line. Clark County was not originally in the Nevada Constitution because it was below the line. It was part of Arizona. It would have been slave, not free. It got added into the Nevada Constitution years later, after the whole, in fact, it didn't get added until the 80s, technically. But all of these compromises, most of them, the Senate, the House, those worked out really well. Their slavery compromise and punting on the issue, in effect, led to the Civil War, but there might not be an America if they hadn't made the compromise. So, something to think about the argument. On a moral basis, they should have done something. They chose, for various reasons, to come up with this compromise that didn't work.